Rachel Thompson had long been considered a living legend, known to those in the world of aviation and the military as Phantom Hawk. She wasn't just a pilot, she was a symbol of excellence, skill, and stealth. Her fame had spread like wildfire during her days as a top fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force, and her presence in the air was the stuff of legends. However, her story had taken an unexpected turn 5 years ago when an injury during a training exercise forced her into retirement. The chronic pain from the injury sidelined her career, and for all intents and purposes, Rachel vanished from the radar, retreating from the life she once knew. Her absence left a gaping hole in the military, but little did the world know, she hadn't truly disappeared. Rachel's life after retirement wasn't spent in the quiet peace she had hoped for. Instead, she had been involved in covert missions, working with intelligence agencies and government operations so secret that even her closest colleagues didn't know what she was up to. Now, after years of silence, Rachel had been summoned back into the fray, not by her own will, but at the request of the Pentagon. A mission awaited her, one that would once again put her in the skies, but this time in a very different role. Rachel's mission was simple, but dangerous. She was tasked with conducting an audit of America's defense capabilities. The Pentagon needed an expert, someone with a deep understanding of military operations, who could evaluate the readiness of America's air defenses. The stakes were high, as there had been growing concerns about untracked threats over the vast expanses of the ocean, and a blind spot in the air defense systems needed to be addressed. Rachel, with her years of experience, was the only person who could provide the insight needed. Her ride for this mission wasn't a sleek, modern fighter jet like she once flew. No, it was an old Cessna 337, a plane she had flown countless times in the past. It had been modified for the job, but it was far from the cutting-edge technology of the F-35s or F-22 Raptors. Despite its age, the Cessna held a place in Rachel's heart. It was her trusted companion back in the day, and now it would be her vehicle to the unknown. The moment Rachel took off, the feeling of the wind beneath the wings was both exhilarating and haunting. She was back in the air, but the familiar sensation brought back memories of a time long gone. The airstrip faded beneath her, and the vast ocean stretched out before her. Rachel's eyes were sharp as ever, scanning the skies and ocean below. But this time, there were no enemy aircraft to face. There was no immediate threat. This was a different kind of mission, one that required the precision of a surgeon rather than the force of a fighter. As Rachel neared the edge of restricted airspace near the USS Liberty, the tension began to rise. Her plane's old systems hummed, almost eerily quiet in the isolation of the open sky. That's when it happened. Her presence didn't go unnoticed. The USS Liberty, one of America's most prestigious aircraft carriers, was within range. The ship's radar system locked onto her aircraft, and within moments, the call was made to intercept. 2 F-35s were scrambled, a routine response to an unauthorized aircraft in restricted airspace. The pilots, part of an elite squadron, were ready to do their job. They had no idea who was in that small Cessna. The order was clear: identify, warn, and if necessary, escort the intruder out of the zone. The tension aboard the USS Liberty was palpable. They were prepared for a standard intercept. But Rachel wasn't about to make it easy for them. She had no intentions of simply complying with the rules. The first call from the F-35 pilots crackled through the radio, ordering her to identify herself. No response. A second call was made, louder this time, more urgent. Still, no response. The USS Liberty was on edge. This wasn't the usual protocol. The time for a standard intercept was slipping away. Then, when all hope for a simple resolution seemed lost, the radio came alive. A voice, calm and firm, spoke through the static. USS Liberty, this is Phantom Hawk. I'm back. There was a pause. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The crew of the USS Liberty froze. Phantom Hawk? That name was legendary. There were stories, rumors, but no one had ever seen her since her retirement. Now, here she was, right in front of them. The F-35 pilots were stunned. They had been prepared for a routine intercept, but this was no ordinary situation. They had just encountered a living legend. The air was thick with the shock of recognition. In the command center, the realization hit: Rachel Thompson, the woman whose name they had only heard in hushed tones, was back. But this time, she wasn't a fighter pilot on a mission of war. She wasn't even active military anymore. She was a civilian, an analyst, sent to evaluate the very air defenses she had once been a part of building. Her return wasn't about a fight. It was about something far more complex. The intercom buzzed to life. The captain of the USS Liberty, recognizing the name, immediately gave orders for a different kind of welcome. Rachel Thompson wasn't just any retired pilot. She was a ghost of the past, the woman who had flown missions no one else dared to attempt. She had been involved in the most secret of operations, with a legacy that was only known to a select few. The F-35s peeled off, circling to escort her as she descended toward the ship. As Rachel's Cessna touched down, the personnel on the deck stood in respect. They were no longer welcoming a retired veteran. They were acknowledging the presence of someone whose legacy was etched into the history of the U.S. Air Force. But Rachel didn't come for a victory lap. She came to do her job. Rachel's Cessna touched down on the deck of the USS Liberty with the precision and ease of someone who had mastered the skies. The crew on the ground stood silent, observing as the small, aging aircraft came to a stop. The hum of the engine slowly faded, but the tension on the deck remained palpable. The F-35s, which had been circling above, now returned to their hangar, their missions aborted. The air around them was thick with questions and curiosity. Rachel climbed out of the cockpit with her usual calmness. Her movements were measured, deliberate, a sharp contrast to the chaotic energy she had left behind in the air. As she walked across the tarmac, heads turned. The pilots, the ground crew, and the officers all recognized the weight of her presence, but none dared speak a word. She had flown missions that were so classified that they had never appeared in any official reports. Her name was spoken only in whispers, a myth, a shadow in the history books. Now she stood before them, no longer a myth but a woman, flesh and blood, here for a purpose. Lieutenant David Carter, the one who had been tasked with intercepting her, stood at the edge of the runway, his gaze fixed on Rachel. As a young, eager pilot with an impressive record, Carter had followed protocol to the letter during the interception. But this was different. He had heard stories about Phantom Hawk, the way she had single-handedly turned the tide in numerous engagements, her uncanny ability to stay one step ahead of the enemy, the raw skill that had made her a legend in the Air Force. But none of that had prepared him for this moment. As Rachel walked past him, Carter snapped to attention, as did the others around him. The respect that followed her name was undeniable. "Lieutenant Carter," Rachel said, acknowledging him with a curt nod. Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable authority in it. "Phantom Hawk," Carter replied, still a bit dazed by the surrealism of it all. "It's an honor." Rachel offered him a brief smile. "I'm not here for honors, Lieutenant. I'm here to do a job. A very important one." Carter followed her as she made her way to the command center, her steps firm and sure. The deck beneath them seemed to tremble slightly, as if acknowledging the gravity of the situation. Inside the command center, the tension had not eased. The officers who had been monitoring the radar screens and communication systems were still processing the fact that the legendary Phantom Hawk was standing before them. The ship's captain, Captain James Connors, stood by the control console, watching Rachel with a look of quiet respect. "Captain Connors," Rachel said, extending her hand. "We need to talk." Captain Connors, though visibly surprised, shook her hand with firmness. "Phantom Hawk, we've been briefed. We understand you've been assigned to evaluate our defenses. We've been anticipating this audit for weeks." Rachel didn't waste time with pleasantries. She moved to the table where maps of the region and defense schematics were laid out. She studied them for a moment, her fingers lightly tracing the lines and zones on the paper. "I'm here to check for any gaps, Captain," she said, her voice steady and authoritative. "The threats out there are evolving faster than our systems can adapt. We need to be ready for anything, unconventional, unknown, or unexpected." As Rachel spoke, the crew quietly filed into the room, each one eager to hear her thoughts. They had trained for years, following every protocol and procedure down to the smallest detail. But now, for the first time in years, they had someone who had been through the fire, someone who had seen what real threats looked like, someone who had survived it all. The captain nodded. "We're ready for your analysis, Rachel. We've been running simulations, but nothing compares to first-hand experience. Your insights will be invaluable." Rachel turned to face him, her eyes focused and unblinking. "I won't sugarcoat it, Captain. Your systems are good, but good isn't enough anymore. The enemy is more cunning than we give them credit for. They adapt quickly, and when you're not looking, they strike. Our radar systems are designed to pick up the obvious, but the world is full of things that don't show up on a screen. We need to think outside of the box. The room fell silent as her words hit home. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, they realized just how vulnerable they might be. Rachel continued, her voice still calm, but with an edge of urgency. I'll be taking a closer look at everything. From radar to communications, to how we handle unexpected threats. I'm not just here to give you a report. I'm here to challenge every assumption you've made about your systems. And we'll see if we're truly prepared. As Rachel set to work, Lieutenant Carter couldn't help but be both awestruck and intimidated by the woman in front of him. This wasn't just a routine audit. This was a reality check. And Rachel Thompson was the one who was going to deliver it. The hours passed as Rachel methodically examined each aspect of the ship's defense systems, her mind working with the precision of a machine. Every detail, every gap, every potential flaw was catalogued. She asked questions no one had thought to ask, and each response led to more insights, more changes, and more adjustments. It wasn't just an audit, it was a complete overhaul of their approach. By the time the sun began to set, the crew had been working non-stop, energized by the urgency Rachel had instilled in them. There was no room for complacency anymore. It was clear that Rachel had brought with her not just the knowledge of a veteran, but the mindset of someone who had been to the front lines and had survived to tell the tale. As the day drew to a close, Rachel stood in front of the control board once more, looking out at the vast ocean stretching before them. She had done what she came to do. But she knew that the real test was still ahead. The future of air defense wasn't just about technology, it was about adaptation, anticipation, and the willingness to face the unknown. "Captain," Rachel said, her voice low but resolute. "We're not ready yet. But we will be. And when the time comes, we'll be prepared." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a crew that now understood the true meaning of readiness. The next morning, the USS Liberty was buzzing with activity. It wasn't just another day at sea. It was a day that would determine the future of their defense systems, and in some ways, the future of America's readiness for unseen threats. Rachel Thompson's presence aboard the ship had already begun to stir the crew into action, pushing them to rethink their approach to everything they had ever known. Rachel was in the ship's operations room early, going over the findings from the day before. The officers and analysts around her were hard at work, listening attentively as she outlined the areas where they needed to make immediate changes. The F-35s, which had once been considered the pinnacle of fighter jet technology, were now seen as one of many tools in their arsenal, not the ultimate solution. She wasn't satisfied with just fixing the current systems. Rachel's mind worked at a deeper level, drawing from years of secretive operations, often running missions that never made it into the history books. The threats she had dealt with in the past were beyond conventional warfare, and it was those kinds of threats she feared were creeping in again. "Rachel, I've been thinking," Lieutenant Carter spoke up, his voice filled with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Yesterday, you mentioned the idea that the enemy adapts quickly, and that we're not seeing everything on our radar. But, what if there's something else we're missing?" Rachel paused, turning toward him. She could sense the weight in his words. He wasn't just asking a theoretical question. There was something deeper he wanted to understand. "What do you mean?" Rachel asked, her tone measured. Carter hesitated for a moment, as if piecing together a puzzle. "What if it's not just technology we're missing, but also knowledge? I mean, with all the missions you've been a part of, is there something you know that could change the way we think about defense? Some insight, perhaps something we've overlooked." Rachel's eyes narrowed as she considered his question. The question wasn't just rhetorical. It was a challenge, a subtle invitation to delve deeper into her past, a past she had tried to leave behind. "I've been part of missions that were so secretive, Carter," Rachel began, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of memories. "I've flown over enemy lines, gathering intelligence, executing strikes, and running operations that were never officially acknowledged. Some of them were so sensitive that even those I worked with didn't know the full scope of what we were doing." The room went silent as Rachel spoke, the officers around her hanging on every word. She wasn't just a veteran returning for an audit, she was someone who had lived through the toughest, most clandestine operations the world had to offer. "We've always operated in the shadows, but sometimes, the shadows themselves hide things we're not equipped to see," Rachel continued. "What I'm trying to say is, the threats we're facing today might not be on the radar because they're not designed to be seen. We need to rethink everything we know about warfare. The future won't just be about who has the best technology, but who can understand the game better. Rachel's words hung in the air like a warning. She wasn't just here to assess the ship's readiness. She was warning them of a future they weren't prepared for, a future where traditional warfare was no longer enough. Her experience had taught her that warfare wasn't always fought with bombs or missiles. Sometimes, it was fought with silence, deception, and stealth. Lieutenant Carter nodded slowly, understanding what Rachel was getting at. So, what do we do now? Rachel walked to the map on the wall, tracing her finger across the outlines of the region. Now, we start preparing for something we can't even see coming. We need to begin thinking in terms of invisibility, unpredictability. Our best defense might not be a fighter jet, it might be something far less conventional. At that moment, Rachel wasn't just a retired legend speaking from experience. She was a guide, pointing them toward a new paradigm, one where they would need to anticipate threats they couldn't even fathom. Later that day, Rachel found herself alone in the quiet of the ship's observation deck, looking out over the vast expanse of the ocean. The deep blue waters stretched endlessly before her, and she couldn't help but think of the many missions she had flown over similar waters. Her mind wandered back to one of those missions, one she had never spoken about to anyone. It had been years ago, and it had started like any other operation. But what had followed, what had unfolded beyond the mission's stated objective, had changed everything she believed about warfare. It was a mission deep in enemy territory, an operation designed to gather intelligence on a new weapon system. But the deeper they went into the heart of enemy lines, the more Rachel realized something was wrong. There were no conventional targets, no soldiers to engage. It was like walking into a ghost town, a place where even the enemy had disappeared without a trace. That was when she discovered the truth. The real threat was never meant to be seen. It was the silence, the invisibility of the enemy forces, the way they could move undetected, even within their own airspace. Rachel and her team had barely made it out alive, but the mission had taught her one invaluable lesson. The future of warfare wouldn't be fought with fighter jets, but with tactics that kept the enemy hidden from view. As Rachel stood at the edge of the ship, she realized that the U.S. military had yet to fully grasp the importance of that lesson. They were still focused on traditional methods of warfare. The enemy they faced now, whoever they were, had already adapted to the future. They understood that silence could be just as deadly as any weapon. Her thoughts were interrupted as Lieutenant Carter approached her, his footsteps light on the metal floor. "Rachel," he said, his voice low, "we've been looking through the data, and I think I understand what you're saying. It's not just about being on the defense. We need to learn how to be invisible too." Rachel nodded, a slight smile tugging at her lips. "Exactly. And that's what we'll start training for." As the sun began to set over the ocean, Rachel Thompson, once the face of military dominance, was now preparing a new generation for a battle they had never imagined. It was a fight not against what they could see, but against the invisible forces lurking just beyond their reach. The USS Liberty was no longer just a ship. It had become a battleground for new ideas, a proving ground for strategies that would shape the future of military defense. The past few days had been a whirlwind of intense analysis, long hours, and deep introspection. Under Rachel's guidance, the crew had started to realize just how far behind they were in terms of adapting to the new threats they would face in the coming years. The ship's command center was a hive of activity as Rachel's analysis of the defense systems continued. Officers were scurrying to implement her suggestions, working furiously to adapt systems that had long been considered state-of-the-art. But Rachel knew that it wasn't enough to simply modify existing technologies. What they needed was a fundamental shift in how they thought about defense, how they understood the battlefield. Lieutenant Carter, still working closely with Rachel, was starting to grasp the magnitude of the changes they had to make. What began as a technical audit had now morphed into a complete rethinking of military strategy. "Rachel," Carter said one morning, breaking through the tension of a room full of officers and engineers, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about the invisibility of the enemy. I know it's going to take time, but what if we're not just talking about stealth in terms of radar or visual detection? What if we start looking at the psychology of warfare? The idea that the enemy doesn't just hide their planes, but also hides their intent." Rachel looked up from the screen she was studying, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. Carter's words struck a chord. She had never considered it in those terms, but now that he mentioned it, it made sense. The enemy might not just be hiding their presence, They could be concealing their very purpose. We need to think like them, Rachel said slowly. We've always assumed that the enemy's objectives are as clear to us as they are to them. But what if their strategy is more subtle? What if the real game is to confuse us, mislead us, make us doubt our own intelligence? Carter nodded. You're saying that our adversaries could be manipulating us into making mistakes, getting us to chase shadows. Exactly, Rachel replied, her eyes narrowing. We've been conditioned to see war as a fight against clear enemies, planes, missiles, ships. But that's the old way of thinking. The new threats are different. They don't just come with bombs and guns. They come with misinformation, confusion, and the ability to influence decisions from a distance. If we want to stay ahead, we have to outthink them, not just outfight them. The room fell silent as the weight of her words sunk in. Rachel had just outlined a new way of looking at warfare, one that involved not just technology but also tactics, psychology, and strategy. In the days that followed, Rachel and Carter began working on a new concept. They would combine the old and the new, blending conventional air defense tactics with psychological warfare techniques. The crew of the USS Liberty would be trained to recognize not just visible threats but also subtle cues that could indicate a hidden attack, signals of misinformation, signs of deliberate confusion, and patterns that could reveal an enemy's hidden hand. Meanwhile, Rachel continued her detailed analysis of the ship systems, making recommendations that would change how the crew operated on a fundamental level. The radar systems would be upgraded to detect not just physical objects but also patterns that could indicate an anomaly in behavior. Communication systems would be refined to spot signs of interference or deception. Even the way the crew responded to new data would be altered. They would be trained to question everything and trust nothing without verification. Despite the overwhelming task at hand, Rachel felt an undeniable sense of purpose. She had returned to this world not just to help the military but to challenge it, to push it toward a new understanding of the complex world they were living in. Her work here wasn't just about reworking old systems. It was about preparing the military for a future that couldn't yet be fully understood. One evening, as Rachel sat alone in the ship's observation lounge, gazing out at the ocean, she thought back to the time when she first started flying. Back then it had all seemed so simple: clear enemies, clear objectives, and a clear path to victory. But now, as the world had become more complex, so too had the way wars were fought. The line between what was visible and what was invisible had blurred, and it was Rachel's job to help the next generation of pilots and strategists navigate that uncertainty. She thought of the countless hours spent in the air, dodging missiles and tracking enemies in hostile skies. That was the old way of thinking. Now, in this new age of warfare, the true battle was against confusion itself. Suddenly, Carter entered the room, breaking Rachel's thoughts. "I've been going over the data," he said, holding up a tablet with a new set of calculations. "There's a pattern emerging. Something we missed earlier." Rachel turned to look at him, her curiosity piqued. "What have you found?" Carter tapped the screen, zooming in on the figures. "It's subtle, but there's something here that doesn't match up. Our systems are picking up an anomaly in the communications network, something that isn't supposed to be there. It's not a physical attack, but it could be an attempt to manipulate our responses." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She had suspected something like this, but seeing it confirmed on the screen was unsettling. The enemy wasn't just invisible in the traditional sense. They were playing a deeper game, one that involved manipulation and misdirection. "We need to act on this immediately," Rachel said, standing up and moving toward the door. "We've just uncovered the first clue in a much bigger puzzle. Let's see where this leads." As they moved to the command center, Rachel felt a renewed sense of urgency. The work they had done so far had been important, but this new revelation could change everything. The battle for the future of defense wasn't just going to be fought in the skies or on the ground. It was going to be fought in the minds of those who made decisions. With each new piece of information, Rachel was starting to realize just how much was at stake. The war was no longer just about defeating enemies. It was about understanding them, predicting their moves, and staying one step ahead at all costs. And as they prepared to investigate this new anomaly, Rachel knew that the USS Liberty had just stepped into a new era of warfare, one where victory wouldn't come from firepower alone, but from the ability to think, adapt, and see what others couldn't. The command center of the USS Liberty hummed with activity as the crew worked frantically to analyze the anomaly Rachel had uncovered. The pattern in the communications network was unlike anything they had encountered before. It wasn't a traditional cyber attack, nor was it a physical breach of their defenses. It was something far subtler, something that seemed almost deliberate. Rachel stood at the center of the room, her mind racing as she observed the data on the large screens in front of her. Lieutenant Carter was beside her, his brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of the encrypted signals. "Look at this," Carter said, pointing to a series of seemingly random data points. "It's almost as if someone is testing our reactions. These signals, they're mimicking what we would expect from a threat, but they're not real." Rachel stepped closer to the screen, her eyes scanning the numbers. It was like trying to read a coded message in a language they didn't yet understand. Every fiber of her experience told her this wasn't a simple glitch in the system, it was far more insidious. "This is psychological warfare," Rachel muttered under her breath. "The enemy isn't trying to infiltrate our systems, they're trying to mess with our heads." Carter looked at her, confused. "How do you mean?" "They're testing our responses, Carter. They want to see if we'll overreact. They want to see if we'll make a mistake. It's all about getting us to question ourselves, to doubt what we see and hear. This isn't just about disrupting our systems, it's about disrupting our decision-making." The realization hit the room like a cold wave. They weren't facing a traditional military threat. The true enemy wasn't a nation or a faction, it was the very nature of uncertainty and deception. The world they were operating in had changed. The battlefield wasn't just in the air, on the sea, or even in cyberspace anymore. It was in their minds. Rachel turned to the ship's captain, who had just entered the command center. "Captain Connors," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "We need to take immediate action. This isn't just about securing the network. We need to prepare the crew for something far more dangerous." Captain Connors nodded, his face grim. "What do you suggest?" "We need to simulate a series of potential threats," Rachel replied. "But not just physical ones. We need to create scenarios that test the crew's ability to distinguish between real and fake threats, to question the information they're receiving, and to act under extreme uncertainty." Connors frowned. "A simulation? You're saying we should deliberately confuse them." "Exactly," Rachel said. "The only way to fight this kind of enemy is to make sure our people are trained to handle uncertainty, to make decisions even when they don't have all the answers. If we don't prepare them for this, we'll be just as vulnerable as the enemy wants us to be." The captain stood still for a moment, absorbing her words. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do it. But we need to make sure we can control it. These simulations can't get out of hand." Rachel gave him a firm nod. "We'll keep it contained. But we need to make sure that everyone on this ship understands what's at stake. If we don't master uncertainty, we won't be ready for anything." The command center sprang to life as orders were given to prepare the simulations. In the coming hours, the ship's crew would undergo one of the most intense training sessions they had ever experienced. The purpose wasn't just to test their skills, it was to challenge their very understanding of what warfare meant in the modern age. As the simulation began, the crew members were fed a series of data streams, each more convincing than the last. False alarms, fake threats, conflicting intelligence, all designed to throw them off balance. The crew was on edge, unsure of what was real and what wasn't. Their every decision felt like a gamble, and the pressure was overwhelming. Rachel stood in the back of the room, watching the crew as they struggled to make sense of the chaos unfolding around them. She could see the stress on their faces, the uncertainty in their eyes. But she also saw something else, a glimmer of understanding. Slowly, they began to adapt, questioning every piece of information, analyzing each signal with a newfound sense of skepticism. Lieutenant Carter was at the helm of one of the simulations, his hands shaking as he processed the data. The room was tense, and the crew could feel the weight of every decision they made. "This is the enemy's game," Rachel said quietly, watching Carter as he worked. "They want us to question everything, to doubt ourselves. But we can't afford to do that. We need to trust our instincts, our training, and most importantly, each other." As the simulation reached its peak, something remarkable happened. The crew began to sync up, their movements and decisions becoming more calculated. They learned to trust one another, to rely on the collective knowledge they had built together. The fear of uncertainty slowly started to dissipate, replaced by a quiet confidence that they could handle whatever came their way. The simulation ended, and the room was filled with a heavy silence. No one spoke for a moment, each person processing what had just happened. They had been tested, and they had passed. But Rachel knew that this was just the beginning. They had learned a valuable lesson, but the true test would come when they faced the real enemy, one they couldn't see, one that would push them to their limits in ways they had never imagined. Captain Connors turned to Rachel, his expression one of deep respect. "You were right," he said. "This is a new kind of war." Rachel nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "It's not about the weapons we have or the planes we fly. It's about how we think, how we make decisions when everything else is in doubt. That's what will keep us ahead of the enemy." As the crew began to disperse, Rachel felt a sense of pride. They had faced the unknown together, and they had come out stronger on the other side. But she knew that the real battle was still ahead. The enemy wasn't just out there, it was everywhere in the information they received, in the decisions they made, and in the very fabric of their reality. But Rachel Thompson wasn't afraid. She had spent her life confronting the unknown, and now more than ever, she knew that the future of warfare wouldn't be determined by who had the strongest weapons. It would be determined by who could think the clearest when everything else was uncertain.